have before us two very eminent personalities. One is, of course, Mr. Kunal Basu, and the other is Avik Chanda. Well, before that, sincere apologies from our end. It honestly was very difficult. I guess all of us are aware of the fact that tomorrow there is a rally for which there's a lot of commotion out there in the road. Therefore, our delegates here, they were a little behind schedule. Nevertheless, a very good afternoon to one and all present here. It's our pleasure from AKLF to have this August gathering. Welcome to the 10th edition of the Apeejay Kolkata Literary Festival. Let's celebrate Park Street. For an introduction, ladies and gentlemen, Kunal Basu, ladies and gentlemen, in my opinion, is one of those critically acclaimed authors. He, if I'm not wrong, has been an author of 5 fictions, one of them being The Opium Clerk, The Miniaturist, The Racist, and of course, the very popular short story, The Japanese Wife, which was adapted into a film by Aparna Sen. But ladies and gentlemen, my personal favorite would always be not Kolkata, not Calcutta, but Kolkata, right? Kolkata, isn't that the pronunciation? Yes, so Kolkata. And Avik Chanda here is a jack of all trades and a master of all, in my opinion. Describing him would be quite a daunting task. I will therefore cut it short here. Moving on to Avik Chanda. Thank you.
Thanks, Indrila. So good afternoon to you all. And delays, politics, traffic jams, welcome back to Kolkata.
Thank you.
So we'll just get started in the interest of time. Through the period that we've sort of been in touch over the years, one thing that has always struck me is how do you begin the creative process? Because you've mentioned to me that you're completely bombarded, you're inundated with ideas for new stories, for books. So how do you make that self-selection? That, okay, this is going to work, this is not going to work. This is going to work, but it's going to be a short story maybe for later. So how do you go about doing that?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. We have been traveling for about 2 kilometers, but it took us a very long time to get here because the nature of traffic here. But thanks again because you were patient. I think I have chemical imbalance in my brain. The reason I'm saying that is because I constantly think of stories. I could be waiting in a bus stop or in a train or sitting in a cafe, overhearing conversation perhaps, and an idea would come floating into my mind. Now, all of these ideas are not worth writing down. Most of these ideas wouldn't actually be worth anything. So the real challenge becomes, when do I take up an idea and then transfer it into some kind of fiction, be it short fiction or a novel or what have you? And the critical thing for me is, if it's an idea that really engages with my heart, with my passion, then I would give it some airtime. Gabriel Garcia Marquez once famously said that there are many stories that you can think about, many stories that appeal at the level of rhetoric. In other words, you would think of the story and say, that's an interesting idea. We all have interesting ideas, right, from time to time. But what he said was, do not make an interesting idea into a novel. Only write those ideas which directly appeal to your passion and to your heart, that keep you awake at night. So when I'm struck by an idea, I try to fight it. I try to tell myself, why do I need to write a book? What's so great about this idea that I will spend so much time in its company? Okay. And I'll only write a novel if the story keeps me awake at night. If it doesn't let go of me. If it keeps egging me on and says, no, you got to write this. Now, the difference between a short story and a novel is, a novel is a long affair. A short story is a one-night stand. Okay? So I need to make a judgment in my mind that if I write a novel, then I'm stuck with this story. We're stuck with this for 2 years. Okay. It takes me about 2 years to research and write and rewrite and redraft. I'm a very fastidious writer. So if I'm able to see an opportunity to spend 2 years in the company of this story, I would say, yes, it is novel material. On the other hand, there may be something that engages my heart, but then I would say, look, this will engage my heart only up until a certain point. That's the scope of its passion. Okay? It's a judgment of the scope of the passion.
And how does that passion translate itself into language? The reason why I ask is you are one of the very few contemporary, truly bilingual writers. I mean, one book, people can say, okay, I've experimented with it, I've dabbled with it, but 3 books of the caliber of Tejashwini or Shobnam establishes you as a Bangla writer. So at what point of time, let's say you've got the idea, right, and it entrances you and enthralls you enough to say, yes, I'm going to stay with this for 2 years, 3 years, as long as it takes to get the book done. But how would you know if that's going to be done in Bangla or in English?
I mean, well, first of all, dekhun, ami Bangali. আমি Ingrej Bangali নই. I was born and raised in this city. I went to a Bengali middle class school. My first language in higher secondary examination was Bangla. And my early published writing, very bad poetry, was in Bangla when I was in college. Okay. So I've always thought of myself as a Bangali. And because we belong to a very strange tribe of people, Bengalis, we are truly the most bilingual tribe on earth. Okay. And I say this because only among a section of Bengalis, the educated, cultured Bengali, the 2 streams, the true language streams, run parallelly. And these 2 language streams run parallelly in terms of their literariness. Okay. And therefore, we don't need to take permission to jump from one pool to the other, from one stream to the other. Okay. So that explains my bilingualism. And I always wanted to write in both languages. The last Bengali author who wrote full-length novels in Bangla and English, one in English and many in Bangla, was none other than Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay in the 19th century. Nobody in the 20th century did. Rabindranath didn't. He could have, but he didn't. Sharat Chandra, Manik, Bibhuti Bhushan, Tara Shankar. And it had wanted to leapfrog over a whole century, and I did want to be the person making that leapfrog. Now, how do I decide whether it is Bangla, it's going to be in Bangla or English? You know, every novel or every story has a subterranean language. Okay? You write a novel in a certain language. You can write it in English. But its subterranean language is of a different world. Okay? I'll give you an example. The Japanese Wife. It's a short story, not a novel. Written in English, but the subterranean language of the Japanese Wife is the particular Bengali dialect of South 24 Parganas, which is called Dokno. Okay? So when you read that novel in English, I think you need to, you can perhaps hear the words in Bangla.
The dialect and also
you can
the flavor.
Perhaps hear the words in Bangla underneath that. The Miniaturist is written in English, my second novel, but its subterranean language is Urdu. So when you're reading the novel, you're probably hearing the words being spoken in Urdu. Now, there comes a time when the manifest language and the subterranean language become one. Okay? And this is a situation where I would write the novel in Bangla. So Tejashwini or Shabnam, although the novel is set in Iraq, is very much a Bengali novel in its manifest form and in its subterranean form.
We'll come back to the Bengali literature in a bit, but talk about Miniaturists and the other novels, such as The Opium Clerk. They're all historical novels. Apart from Kolkata, they belong in the genre of what is conventionally called historical novels. Why do you think that in today's digital age, in the 21st century of gadgets and IoT and AI, why is history still relevant?
Because we love him. Okay. You know, what you love never goes out of fashion. Okay. Which is why we stay married, for example. Okay. So, look, I'm a failed historian. I should have studied history in school, but I was stupid, so I studied science. Okay. I really should have pursued a career in the liberal arts, but I made the fatal mistake of studying engineering and management. Okay, so the historian
and teaching it.
Yeah, and so the historian inside me is still bleeding, is still trying to find a way to come out. Okay, and therefore, and also bear in mind that in Bangla, growing up reading Bangla, we are all enthralled by historical fiction. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, Sharadindu, Ramesh Chandra Datta, and others. And as a person who's a romantic at heart, which is who I am, I'm naturally drawn towards historical fiction, which is my, the major incentive for me to think of it. Why in this age historical fiction is important? Because remember, surface realities change. In every day and age, surface realities of life change. But the fundamentals of civilization remain the same. Okay? And in many ways, history brings forth the fundamentals of civilization. Okay? Somebody once asked me, your first novel, The Opium Clerk, was about opium. You've written a novel which is about a dreaded disease called syphilis. Yeah.
And about the world of gigolos.
Yeah, and in the Kolkata is about a male prostitute. Why is that? I said, look, drugs, sex, and disease never go out of fashion. Okay? So your surface realities might change, but the fundamentals of civilization persist, and therein lies the hook of history.
Great. Now let's come to conveying the reality of a bygone era, right? So if you're talking about political intrigues, violence, sex, lust for power, that never goes out of fashion. But if we talk about the miniaturist, you employ what you've termed essential language. So it's not a grandiloquent Farsi that's just transcribed literally into English, but it's a far more simple but elemental, strong idiom in English, and you're still capturing that. So talk to us about the essential language and how that's deployed.
When I was thinking about writing this novel, The Miniaturist, and I was researching, I was traveling in Pakistan, in Mughal India, in Iran, in Afghanistan, in Turkey, in other places. A good friend of mine, the historian Ramchandra Guha, you probably know Ramchandra Guha, right? So Ram said, well, Kunal, how are you going to write dialogue for the Mughals? The Mughals spoke in Chuktai Turk. The language of the Mughals was Chuktai Turk. Their court language was Persian. Okay? How are you going to write in English dialogue for the Mughals? And it's an interesting question. It's an important question. And I said, look, in the Mughal times, there were still relationships between fathers and sons, between friends, between masters and students, teachers and students, between husbands and wives, between men and their mistresses, right? So the fundamental communication elements were precisely the same then as they are now. So if today a father is very upset with his son for not studying, he would say, stop flying kites and go and read your books. You've got an exam coming up. Okay? Guess what? A Mughal courtier would tell his deviant son, who was only interested in painting and not interested in studying. He would say, go read the Quran, otherwise you will be an ignoramus. Okay? So the fundamental or the essential relationship remains the same. And what I did not want to do is actually, I did not want to create a false language, okay? Merely to convey the aura of the time. I wanted to convey the aura of the time through other means, such as the sights, the sounds, and the other sensations that one might feel.
Could you give us a glimpse of the essential language, maybe reading out a passage from The Miniaturist, if you're carrying that book?
You want me to?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I'm sure we all would.
This book came out in 2003, so it's a pretty, it's quite dated.
History is never dated.
The novel is really about a child prodigy. Behzad is a child prodigy in the court of Emperor Akbar. Okay? He is the son of the court artist of Akbar, and he's incredibly talented. But being an incredibly talented person, he's also precocious, he's rebellious. He doesn't want to follow the regular path. So in this segment that I will read to you, he's having an interaction with his teacher, who's a very strict person called Mir Said Ali. At 14, Behzad refused to go for his lessons. It had started a few months earlier with a few arguments. First, he had refused to draw the Shamsa, the ornamental sunburst that was the frontispiece to all important manuscripts. Mir Said Ali, normally severe, had ignored his defiance. The word was spreading of a child wonder. Wealthy patrons of Agra were keen to have their portraits drawn by his young fingers. A touch of youth to soften the blows of time. The courtier servants would stop Mir Said Ali frequently on his way to the Kitab Khana, whisper their requests into his good ear. The boy had an exceptional hand. It was time now to share his fruits. The emperor's physician, the royal Hakim, was his first commission. Draw him, Mir Said Ali said, then he left the room. Behzad looked in silence, gazing straight into the Hakim's eyes, as if he were the physician and his subject the patient. The royal Hakim frowned. When Mir Said Ali returned, he found a portrait in black and white. Wrinkled fingers, worn knuckles, veins rising up the neck like a pair of snakes, cross-legged and cross-eyed. The elderly artist had made excuses, showed the royal Hakim out of the room, inviting him to return soon for another sitting. Then he turned to Behzad. Holding out a brush in one hand, the other raised to strike, he ordered his pupil to begin again. But you asked me to draw his likeness, not of him, of his true self. The blow struck Behzad's face. Who do you think you are, a clerk? A convict under oath, speaking the truth and nothing but the truth? Then the boy refused to illustrate the memoirs of the emperor's grandfather, Babur, the first great Mughal himself. Who are you to refuse? If the great Kamaluddin Behzad, your namesake, could illustrate the warrior Timur's life, why should you refuse to do Babur's? Why should an artist draw only Razam o Bazam? Razam o Bazam? The word seemed too big for his sweet face. War and love, love, war, love, war, love, war. For once, Mir Said Ali looked at him kindly. The artist was awakening. It was time perhaps for the child to become a man. He laid his hand on Behzad's shoulder. Neither war nor love. You haven't understood, Behzad. With a great effort, he reached inside an old box, recovered 3 miniatures from it, and laid them out in front of Behzad, dusting the first lightly with a brush. The most magnificent painting in all of Persia. It was the night of the chosen one, mounted on the mythical horse Burak, and preceded by the archangel Gabriel, the prophet, from whose head streamed a fiery radiance, emerged from the clouds into the profound blue of the night sown with stars. The black sky became a garden. The earth swam far below him. Winged angels rushed to his company as he passed beyond the realm of this world. The two sat silently. Then turning to the second, the death of Majnun at Layla's grave, Mir Said Ali started to recite Nizami's poems. Behzad saw the child lovers, one dead, the other dying. The throbbing passion muted, then returning with an ever-deepening note. Eyes like black narcissi shedding tears upon a rose. A dazzling gold from the glare of the desert under a sky of pure lapis into which drifted curling wisps of white cloud. Not war, but triumph. Surrender, not love, and prayer. Behzad, listen. You must see what he sees, not the view of the mortal, but a glorious world washed clean in magical light and dazzling with color. You must copy in miniature the world he has drawn, one where everything is carefully chosen, the profusion of nature simplified, men and women incomparably beautiful, everything as precious and perfect as he willed them to be. Mir Said Ali sighed. His hard face softened. Remember, Behzad, remember, the artist is closest of all to the creator.
That was brilliant. Shall we graduate or transcend or maybe regress from the historical to the contemporary? Now, Kolkata is set in contemporary times, but again, maybe it's just my reading of the novel. But when I stay with particular characters, to take an example, Mushtaq, who is the uncle of the protagonist. He is a mover and shaker on the ground as the novel begins. He is a bigwig in a political party, but towards the end of the novel, it almost seems as if history, like a fast train, has kind of overrun him and passed him by and rendered him redundant. So do we have a sense of history in the making as well in
Yeah,
Kolkata?
absolutely. Look, there are a lot of people who believe that there's nothing called a historical novel. I mean, all novels are historical because they deal with time. And history slips through your fingers. You know, we don't observe, but history slips through our fingers, right? So you're absolutely right. Kolkata starts with prior to 2013 when the Left Front was in power. And Uncle Mushtaq was a big wig of the Communist Party. By the end of the novel, he's turned into a fossil because time has passed by. The political formations have changed. He's no longer powerful. He's an old and sick man who sits inside a room and reads Karl Marx. Okay? This is not a denunciation of a doctrine. It is merely a recording of a passage of time. So in that sense, it is historical.
You mentioned just a little while back that you are by nature quite fastidious, right? And maybe your being an academic in your day job, in your other life, seeps over to the kind of detail that you employ when doing research on all your projects. So just to give an example, and I hope I'm not misquoting here, the very first sentence in The Miniaturist, right, talks about the astrological configurations, right? And the reason why that really, really struck home to me is when you read, for example, the Babar-Nama or the Humayun-Nama or the chronicles written by Abul Fazl, there is a lot of reference to that. So it requires that level of detail to do the research. But I think you also do incredible amount of thinking even when choosing the names of your characters. So if you come to the Japanese wife, Snehomoy, why Snehomoy, Miyagi, why Miyagi?
Just to digress a little bit, I was reading from the Japanese wife during the screening of the film in Singapore. And the Japanese ambassador to Singapore was in the audience. So when it came time for questions and answers, he said, why did you name this person Miyagi? I said there were two reasons, really. One is, one of my favorite Japanese film directors is called Mizoguchi. And the film that I like very much is called Ugetsu Monogatari. In that film, Ugetsu Monogatari, in black and white, shot many years ago, you have a character called Miyagi. And when I watched the film, I absolutely fell in love with this character. Okay? And I resolved that if I ever have a daughter, I will name her Miyagi. Okay? Now, as it turns out, we did have a daughter. But when she was born, I was so overwhelmed, I forgot. So I didn't name her Miyagi, I named her something else. Okay? That name was already, I wanted to use it. I wanted to use it somewhere. But the real reason is, the word Miyagi in Japanese means gift. And in Snehoma's life, Miyagi, this Japanese woman from far away Japan, came as a gift. So there was a resonance of sorts. Now, yes, research is important to me, and I'm fastidious in research, but there is a difference between research that an academic does and research that a fiction writer does. And I'm very cognizant of this difference. Otherwise, one can get into trouble. You see, in academic life, when I advise one of my PhD students, for example, I would say, you must read everything that has been written on this subject, absolutely everything. Okay? so that you are the absolute master of all scholarship in this area. There can be no exceptions. Okay? When you're doing research for novels or for fiction, this is precisely the wrong advice to give. Because if you read, overread, and if you read again, then it hangs as a cloud over your imagination. And it restricts you. Okay? And your novel begins to read like non-fiction in disguise or an essay in disguise. And there are many examples of that. Okay? So I'm very conscious that I will only research up to a point which will allow my imagination to fly. And I shall read no further.
Let's go back to the christening of names. Snehomoy, Miyagi. Similar to that, there's Jamshed Alam, right? And if I just look literally at the meanings of the names of the protagonist in Kolkata, Jamshed means lambent or shining or radiant twin. So there's the element of the twin. And Alam, jeta amra Banglaye boli, which is taken from the Farsi, or lam, which means word or universe. So if I just put these two together, concatenate two together, I have a radiant twin universe, right? So kothao ki are we saying that the world and the existence that Jamshed has throughout the narrative, he is at best allowed to glimpse the lives of the fortunate, of the privileged, from an outsider's standpoint. And maybe somewhere at the obverse of this darkness, there is lambent universe.
I'm very grateful to you, Avik, that you've picked up this particular allusion that I was trying to get across. Yes, those were sort of the kinds of thinking that went behind naming Jamshed. I don't think there's any reviewer who's quite picked it up. So you're probably the first person to sort of picked it up, and that warms my heart. Yeah.
Why is it that you've never written what is your day job? So you've never written a management book or a business book, or even a very learned academic book on the subjects that you teach?
Yeah, I don't want to go into a very long explanation, but let me just tell you this, that in my job, I teach in Oxford University, which is a research university. If you are in a research university, you're expected to publish research papers which are peer-reviewed. And the more you publish them, the more brownie points you get. The more you're promoted, you become a professor, people think that you're doing good work. In that world, if you write a book, as in a book, it's considered that your research career is now over. And you're actually recycling material that you have collected or you have done, and you're writing it down as a book. Now, I see Pinaki smiling, because only academics and boring academics get this. Nobody else gets this, and people will say, why not write a book on management? It's because if I did, my colleagues would give me strange looks and say, what's wrong with you, Kunal? I thought you were a good researcher. Okay? But that's a very separate kind of conversation. By the way, management is not my day job. This is my day job. Teaching is my occasional job.
Given that you spend, 10 to 12 hours thinking, ruminating, writing, redrafting every day on an average?
Yes. Barring today. I mean today I've had to come here, but I was writing in the morning, and then when I go back, I'll write again.
Lovely. What about poetry? So you say it was terrible, it was bad, right? But we have no evidence of your juvenilia, so it might be great. You might have been a precocious Shomoshen revisited. So why not go back to poetry? Have you thought about that?
Actually, I need to correct myself. My first publication in English were English poems, which were published in the US when I lived in the US. But I never thought of putting them together from a variety of literary journals into a book. Sometimes my agent would say, why don't I do that? But I'm frankly not very tempted at this point, largely because I've been in a track of writing fiction for the last 20 years, and I've not been able to jump off that track. Okay? Is it worthwhile to do it? Yes. Is it worthwhile to write a bit of non-fiction around some aspect of life, perhaps? Yes. Is it exciting to write a memoir? perhaps. Okay. But unfortunately, I've become grooved into the line of fiction, and all these strange story ideas keep bubbling inside my head. So as soon as I finish a book, I jump into another book. I finish a novel and I jump into another novel. So that's a very long way of answering your question, saying, poetry, perhaps. But again, I need to feel really passionately devoted to poetry in a part of my life when I can spend time in her company.
Do you, when you, let's say, reread your work or redraft particular passages, look at them afresh and find lyrical images in that? I'll give you an example, okay? There's a lady, there's a woman who does the simplest thing possible. She's in a room, and she just switches off the light, and she just goes outside onto the main street, onto the high street, right, high road, where there is more light. It's as simple and as banal as that. But to say, Tejoshini, bhetorer alo nibiye, bairer aloy beriye porlo, that has a lot of lyricism and visual imagery in it, which is pure poetry, in my mind.
Yeah, I'm drawn by lyricism, but I do want to make a distinction, a very quick distinction. A lot of contemporary, and I'm going to say this carefully because it's a point of, other people may criticize me for that. A lot of contemporary Bangla fiction, not all of it, but a lot of it, is full of very vapid lyricism. You know, there's a difference between vapid lyricism and spare lyricism. Okay, I'm really drawn to the writing of John Coetzee, to Michael Ondaatje, who are very lyrical writers, but they're lyrical in a very spare sense.
Very sparse.
Yeah, very spare sense. And that kind of spare lyricism really appeals to me. Okay, not the vapid kind of lyricism, you know, where you একটা উপমা দিয়ে একটা কাজ হয়ে যায় সেখানে চারটি উপমা দিলাম ওকে একটা বিষয়কে এতবার পুনরাবৃত্তি করলাম যে সেটা at the end of it the poetry of it is all lost. Okay, and we Bengalis আমাদের একটা অতি কথনের tendency আছে. We tend to overspeak, you know, we over explain. Perhaps I've already explained what but see, I'm still explaining, okay. So I'm really drawn to spare lyricism. And do I, when I'm editing, do I have a special eye for lyricism? The answer is no. But, as John Irving, the author John Irving once said, half a writer's life is spent in the act of editing. Okay. So we think we are all writing, stuff, but actually half of our writing time is spent editing. And I love editing. Absolutely love editing. And I'm working on my a new novel in English, which is a contemporary novel set in Kolkata, but which is not the world of Calcutta. It's a very different Kolkata, which is the world of Park Street, okay, coincidentally. So I do find lyrical elements there as well, but I'm not trying deliberately to heighten lyricism. How are we doing for time?
Let's give it another 10 minutes and a couple of questions from the audience. So in terms of writing, rewriting, drafting, do you see yourself making like a full redraft of a novel typically? How long does that process take? And when you come back to a novel, do you introduce new elements to it or just keep morphing what you already have?
You see, the first draft is like the first pangs of an affair because you don't know that person. You're trying to, feel your way through. You're saying something and you're seeing how that person will react, okay? You're trying to establish a relationship. And I'm using this metaphor for a very, very specific reason. Once you feel assured of that relationship, then you start tweaking things. Then you start qualifying yourself. You say, well, remember I told that to you 5 months back? Well, it's that, but it's slightly different, okay? So the first draft of a novel is a very anxious and a fraught process for me because I'm telling myself the story. I'm not telling the readers the story yet. I've started with a premise, I've built a few characters, I've created a setting, I've created a flow, and I'm telling myself, so what is this going to turn out to be? Where is this novel going to go? What will happen to the characters? Who will live? Who will die? Who will marry who? Okay. So once I've figured this out and the first draft is finished, I've told myself the story. That's when I start breathing a bit easily. And then I go in and say, all right, if this is the story, what part of this story and how should this story be told to you, the reader? And then I start to fashion the novel out of the first drafts. Is it a full rewriting? Oftentimes it is. Oftentimes it is.
Tell us about the novel that you're writing currently.
I mean, I couldn't. My agent will kill me.
Okay, we don't need the name a little bit, anything at all?
No, it's a novel which is set in contemporary Kolkata. It has a whole bunch of very weird characters, which is not unusual if you read my books. But they're not the world. It's not the world of Zakaria Street or Chitpur. It is the world of, in some sense, the Bengali middle class. In some sense, the world of Park Street. You know, but also populated by. Let me say it this way. The most exciting thing about writing fiction is to make the familiar unfamiliar and the unfamiliar familiar. Okay? So you would think that you know Park Street. Hopefully, after you read my novel, you will see an unfamiliar of Park Street. Okay? And hopefully you think that this is a part of Kolkata that's completely unfamiliar to you. Hopefully after reading that novel, you'll find that to be a familiar world.
And when's it going to be published? Early next year, or is it end of this year?
In the United Kingdom, where my English books get published first in the UK and then in other parts of the world, the publication cycle is a long publication cycle. Mm-hmm. In other words, this novel that I'm writing now will be published in 2020, not in 2019, not this year.
Okay. Okay. Does cinema, which obviously has appealed to you, and for want of time, we haven't been able to go through your passion with cinema and your involvement with films. But do you write with cinematic images in mind, and also post The Japanese Wife and the reception that it's got? Is there sometimes a temptation to write in a very cinematic form?
No, I've answered this question in a fair amount of detail in other places, so I'll be brief here. For me, most important thing is imagery, right? Imagery is very important in my writing. If I can't see something, I can't write it. So I have to imagine this scene. I have to think about the light. I have to think about the setting of the tables. I have to look at your facial expressions if I have to write about this scene, okay? If I can't see it, I won't be able to write it. That's the way I am as a writer, okay? I'm a visual writer driven by sensory inputs. Not every writer has to be like this, but that's the way I am. So, when I write my books, my novels and short stories, sometimes you can read it and say, so has he written this with cinema in mind? No, okay? But that's my access into a story is a visual access. I'm a failed artist. What can I do? That's the way it is. Have I been tempted by cinema? I mean, who isn't? I mean, we are all seduced by cinema, but have I written consciously with cinema in mind? I don't think so.
Well, I think sometimes failed painters make fantastic authors. And you're talking about Japanese authors. I think preeminent amongst them, Yasunari Kawabata, was also in his adolescent and youthful years an aspiring painter, and then he became the storyteller that we know. So we began with the genesis of the creative process, the flash in an eye, right, in an eye blink. And let's conclude with the ending, right? And to borrow a leaf from Julian Barnes, the sense of an ending. How does the endings for your stories and novels come about?
Organically, instinctively. If I say that I have a plan, look, authors are different. There's some authors who minutely script out their whole novels, chapter by chapter, okay? And say, this is where it goes from here to here to here to here. I can't do that. The relationship loses fun if I do it. It has to be full of surprises, twists and turns. But I'd be lying if I said I would not keep track of the movement inside my mind. See, in some sense, I'm trying to follow my impulse. In some sense, I'm trying to fool myself. I say, let's see where it can go. Let's see where all of this goes. And in almost every case, my novel, the ending of my novel has been guided by the instinct and the impulse of the moment, okay? Now, people have asked this question, could the novel have ended in a different way? Of course it could have. this is not what has happened in life. This is what I've made up to be. So could I have made it up differently? Could I have, rather than killing off Snehomai in the end? And I remember I was reading from this novel in Bali, in Indonesia. And at the end of it, there's this Australian woman who comes up to me, all crying and weeping. And she says, "Why did you make me cry?" I said, "I'm sorry. I mean, what did I do? Why did you kill off Snehomai?" I said, "Well, in my mind, he had to go. Now, why couldn't you get the Japanese woman and this Indian man to marry?" And I said, "Well, come and live in Bali." Yeah, that could have been an ending too. I mean, it could have been, but I didn't see that. So it's personal, it's very instinctive, it's impulsive at that moment that leads to an ending.
I think we'd all like to hear the way Snehomai and Miyagi's tale ends.
Okay, this is very brief, just one paragraph. But I will tell you this. When I was watching The Japanese Wife, the film, the last sequence of the film when Miyagi, do people know what this film is about? You do, right? And the story. So when Miyagi comes, head shaved in white, to Sundarban after Snehomai has passed away. Okay? And there's this shot where the camera tilts up, and she's getting off the boat, the camera tilts off, and you see this right on the horizon, this Japanese woman looking very alien, head shaved, coming up. Okay? It brought a lump to my throat. Now, I have written this piece, but hats off to Aparna Sen. The way she visualized it actually took me, the author, out of my skin and made me into a viewer. The storm struck Shonai with a venom, erasing the boundary of tamarind and neem. As usual, it blew off the hay from peasants' huts and damaged the school building. Fortunately, the ferry had stopped plying and docked at a safe harbor. It returned in autumn when the river was full but calm. In the lull of winter, the only passage of significance was the untimely death of Snehomai Chakraborty, the mathematics teacher at the secondary school, from the killer mosquitoes that spread a wider havoc than the river. Besides friends and neighbors who knew him well, the whole village mourned his loss. The orphaned boy who had studied in the city but returned. The teacher who seldom erred before his students. Words weren't enough to console his poor aunt. At her request, the headmaster had written to Snehomai's wife, who lived far away, informing her of the terrible loss. Then she came, head shaven, wearing the white of a Hindu widow. At Canning, she boarded the ferry. Sitting upright, looking out towards the horizon, her alien features drew attention. Reaching Shonai, she crossed the muddy path over the banks, called for a rickshaw, and asked to be taken to the house of the teacher, the one with the Japanese wife.
As we come to the end of the session,
we genuinely appreciate Mr. Kunal Vasu coming all the way to DCPL here. He has a session at Allen Park starting at 2:40, after which he is going to be seated at the Author's Lounge for the book signing session. So all of you can go right away there. And if you want more of him, then of course there's Allen Park where he will be doing his next session. But ladies and gentlemen, it was an amazing audience, I must say. Truth be told, we have had quite an engaging audience with